18. The Plains of Ra. Despite the battleground, despite the acrid smoke of flame and flesh and power, despite the nearby trenches where the dead were graved like lumps of charred agony, piled wearily into the earth like accumulated pain for which only the ground could now find use or surcease, despite his own inner torn and trampled ground, Covenant slept. For what was left of the night, the other survivors of the battle labored to bury or burn the various dead, but Covenant slept. Restless unconsciousness arose from within him, like a perpetually enumerated VSE, and he spent his repose telling in dreams that rigid ground, left arm shoulder to wrist, left hand palm at back, each finger, right arm, shirt, chest, left leg. He awoke to meet a dawn which wore the aspect of an uncomfortable tomb. Shuddering himself to his feet, he found that all the work of burying was done. Each of the trenches was filled, covered with dirt, and planted with a sapling which Biranair had found somewhere. Now most of the warriors lay awkwardly on the ground in fatigue, searching themselves for some kind of strength. But Prothal and Moram were busy cooking a meal, and the Bloodguard were examining and readying the horses. A spate of disgust crossed Covenant's face, disgust that he had not done his share of the work. He looked at his robe. The samite was stiff and black with encrusted blood. Fit apparel for a leper, he thought, an outcast. He knew that it was past time for him to make a decision. He had to determine where he stood in his impossible dilemma. Propped on his staff in the sepulchral dawn, he felt that he had reached the end of his evasions. He had lost track of his self-protective habits, lost the choice of hiding his ring, lost even his tough boots. And he had shed blood. He had brought down doom on soaring Woodhelven. He had been so preoccupied with his flight from madness that he had not faced the madness toward which his fleeing took him. He had to keep moving. He had learned that. But going on posed the same impenetrable problem: participate and go mad, or refuse to participate and go mad. He had to make a decision, find bedrock somewhere and cling to it. He could not accept the land and could not deny it. He needed an answer. Without it, he would be trapped like Laura, forced to the tune of Fow's glee to lose himself in order to avoid losing himself. Then Moram looked up from his stirring and saw the disgust and dismay on Covenant's face. Gently the Lord said, "What troubles you, my friend?" For a moment Covenant stared at Moram. The Lord looked as if he had become old overnight. The smoke and dirt of battle marked his face, accentuating the lines on his forehead and around his eyes like a sudden aggravation of wear and decay. His eyes seemed dull by fatigue, but his lips retained their kindness, and his movements, though draped in such a rent and bloodied robe, were steady. Covenant flinched instinctively away from the tone in which Moram said, "My friend." He could not afford to be anyone's friend, and he flinched away too from his impulse to ask what had caused Tamarantha's staff to become so violent in his hands. He feared the answer to that question. To cover his wincing, he turned roughly away and went in search of Foamfollower. The giant was sitting with his back to the last standing extinguished fragment of soaring Woodhelven. Grime and blood darkened his face. His skin had the color of a flaw in the heart of a tree. But the wound on his forehead dominated his appearance. Ripped flesh hung over his brows like a foliage of pain, and through the wound drops of new blood seeped as if red thoughts were making their way from a crack in his skull. He had his right arm wrapped around his great jug of diamond draught, and his eyes followed Laura as she tended little Python. Covenant approached the giant, but before he could speak, Foam Follower said, "Have you considered them? Do you know what has been done to them?" The question raised black echoes in Covenant's mind. "I know about her." "And Python, tiny Python, a child?" Covenant shrugged awkwardly. "Think, Unbeliever." His voice was full of swirling mists. "I am lost. You can understand." With an effort, Covenant replied, "The same thing, just exactly what's been done to us and to Laura." A moment later he added mordantly, "And to the cave whites." Foam Follower's eyes shied, and Covenant went on. "We're all going to destroy whatever we want to preserve." The essence of Foul's method, Python, is a present to us, an example of what we're going to do to the land when we try to save it. Foul is that confident, and prophecies like that are self-fulfilling. At this, Foam Follower stared at Covenant as if the Unbeliever had just laid a curse on him. Covenant tried to hold the giant's eyes, but an unexpected shame made him drop his head. He looked at the power-scorched grass. The burning of the grass was curious. Some patches did not look as wrong as others. Apparently Lord's fire did less essential damage than the might of the Erviles. After a moment, Foam Follower said, "You forget that there is a difference between a prophet and a seer. Seeing the future is not prophecy." Covenant did not want to think about it. To get away from the subject, he demanded, "Why didn't you get some of that hurt loam for your forehead?" This time Foam Follower's eyes turned away. Distantly he said, "There was none left." His hands opened and closed in a gesture of helplessness. Others were dying, and others needed the hurt loam to save their arms or legs. And his voice stumbled momentarily. "And I thought tiny Python might be helped. He is only a child," he insisted, looking up suddenly with an appeal that Covenant could not understand. But one of the cave whites was dying slowly, in such pain. A new trickle of blood broke open in his forehead and began to drip from his brow. "Stone and sea," he moaned. "I could not endure it. Herthrall Birinair kept aside a touch of hurtloam for me from all the wounds to be treated, but I gave it to the cave white, not to Python, to the cave white, because of the pain." Abruptly, he put back his head and took a long pull of diamond draught. With the heel of his palm, he wiped roughly at the blood on his brows. Covenant gazed intently at the giant's racked visage. Because he could find no other words for his sympathy, he asked, "How are your hands?" "My hands?" Foam Follower seemed momentarily confused, but then he remembered. "Ah, the Kamora. My friend, I am a giant," he explained. "No ordinary fire can harm me, but the pain teaches many things." A flinch of self-disgust crossed his lips. "It is said that the giants are made of granite," he mumbled. "Do not be concerned for me." On an impulse, Covenant responded, "In parts of the world where I come from, there are little old ladies who sit by the side of the road, pounding away all day on hunks of granite with little iron hammers. It takes a long time, but eventually they turn big pieces into little pieces." Foam Follower considered briefly before asking, Is that prophecy, Lord Covenant? Don't ask me. I wouldn't know a prophecy if it fell on me. Nor would I, said Foam Follower. A dim smile tinged his mouth. Shortly, Lord Moram called the company to the meal he and Prothal had prepared. Through a haze of suppressed groans, the warriors pried themselves to their feet and moved toward the fire. Foam Follower lurched upright. He and Covenant followed Laura and Python to get something to eat. The sight and smell of food suddenly brought Covenant's need for decision to a head. He was empty, hollow with hunger, but when he reached out to take some bread, he saw how his arm was befouled with blood and ashes. He had killed. The bread dropped from his fingers. This is all wrong, he murmured. Eating was a form of acquiescence, a submission to the physical actuality of the land. He could not afford it. I've got to think. The emptiness in him ached with demands, but he refused them. He took a drink of spring wine to clear his throat, then turned away from the fire with a gesture of rejection. The lords and Foam Follower looked after him inquiringly, but made no comment. He needed to put himself to the test, discover an answer that would restore his ability to survive. With a grimace, he resolved to go hungry until he found what he required. Perhaps in hunger he would become lucid enough to solve the fundamental contradiction of his dilemma. All the abandoned weapons had been cleared from the glade, gathered into a pile. He went to it and searched until he found Aetiarin's stone knife. Then, on an obscure impulse, he walked over to the horses to see if Dura had been injured. When he learned that she was unscathed, he felt a vague relief. He did not want, under any circumstances, to be forced to ride a Ranahin. A short time later, the warriors finished their meal. Wearily, they moved to take up the quest again. As Covenant mounted Dura, he heard the Bloodguard whistle sharply for the Ranahin. The call seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Then, from various directions around the glade, the great horses came galloping, manes and tails flaring as if afire, hooves pounding in long, mighty, trip-rhythmed strides. 9 star-browed chargers, as swift and elemental as the life pulse of the land. Covenant could hear in their bold nickering the excitement of going home toward the plains of Ra. But the questers who left dead soaring Woodhelven that morning had little of the bold or home-going in their attitudes. Quan's yeoman was now 6 warriors short, and the survivors were gaunt with weariness and battle. They seemed to carry their shadows in their faces as they rode north toward the Mythal River. The riderless horses they took with them to provide relief for the weaker mounts. Among them, Saltheart Foam Follower trudged as if he were carrying the weight of all the dead. In the crook of one arm he cradled Python, who had fallen asleep as soon as the sun cleared the eastern horizon. Laura rode behind Lord Moram, gripping the sides of his robe. She appeared bent and frail behind his grim-set face and erect posture, but he shared with her an eroded expression, an air of inarticulate grief. Ahead of them moved Prothal, and his shoulders bespoke the same kind of inflexible will which Aetiarin had used to make Covenant walk from Mythal down to the Solstice River. Vaguely, Covenant wondered how much farther he would have to follow other people's choices. But he let the thought go and looked at the blood guard. They were the only members of the company who did not appear damaged by the battle. Their short robes hung in tatters. They were as filthy as anyone. One of their number had been killed, and several were injured. They had defended the lords, especially Variol and Tamarantha, to the utmost. But the blood guard were unworn and undaunted, free of rue. Banor rode his prancing, reinless Ranahin beside Covenant, and gazed about him with an impervious eye. The horses of the company could manage only a slow, stumbling walk, but even that frail pace brought the riders to the ford of the Mithil before noon. Leaving their mounts to drink or graze, all of them except the blood guard plunged into the stream. Scrubbing at themselves with fine sand from the river bottom, they washed the blood and grit and pain of death and long night into the wide current of the Mithil. Clear skin and eyes reappeared from under the smears of battle. Minor, unhurt-loamed wounds opened and bled clean. Scraps of shredded clothing floated out of reach. Among them, Covenant beat his robe clean, rubbed and scratched stains from his flesh as if he were trying to rid himself of the effects of killing. And he drank quantities of water in an effort to appease the aching hollowness of his hunger. And then, when the warriors were done, they went to their horses to get new clothing from their saddlebags. After they had dressed and regained command of their weapons, they posted themselves as sentries while first Mark Tuvor and the blood guard bathed. The blood guard managed to enter and leave the river without splashing, and they washed noiselessly. In a few moments they were dressed in new robes and mounted on the Ranahin. The Ranahin had refreshed themselves by crossing into Andalain and rolling on the grass while their riders bathed. Now the company was ready to travel. High Lord Prothal gave the signal, and the company rode away eastward along the south bank of the river. The rest of the day was easy for the riders and their mounts. There was soft grass underhoof, clean water at one side, a tang of vitality in the air, and a nearby view of Andalain itself, which seemed to pulse with robust sap. The people of the land drew healing from the ambience of the hills. But the day was hard for Covenant. He was hungry, and the vital presence of Andalain only made him hungrier. He kept his gaze away from it as best he could, refusing the sight as he had refused food. His gaunt face was set in stern lines, and his eyes were hollow with determination. He followed a double path. His flesh rode Dura doggedly, keeping his position in the company, but in his mind he wandered in chasms, and their dark, empty inanition hurt him. I will not, he wanted to survive. I am not. From time to time, Aliantha lay directly in his path like a personal appeal from the land, but he did not succumb. Covenant, he thought. Thomas Covenant, unbeliever, leper outcast unclean, with a pang from his hunger. When a pang from his hunger made him waver, he remembered Drool's bloody grip on his ring, and his resolve steadied. From time to time, Laura looked at him with the death of soaring Woodhelven in her eyes, but he only clenched himself harder and rode on. I won't do any more killing. He had to have some other answer. That night he found that a change had come over his ring. Now all evidence that it resisted red encroachments was gone. His wedding band burned completely crimson under the dominion of the moon, flaming coldly in his hand as if in greedy response to Drool's power. The next morning he began the day's riding like a man torn between opposing poles of insanity. But there was a foretaste of summer in the noon breeze. The air turned warm and redolent with the ripeness of the earth. The flowers had a confident bloom, and the birds sang languidly. Gradually, Covenant grew full of lassitude. Languor loosed the strings of his will. Only the habit of riding kept him on Dura's back. He became numb to such superficial considerations. He hardly noticed when the river began to curve northward away from the company, or when the hills began to climb higher. He moved blankly on the warm currents of the day. That night he slept deeply, dreamlessly, and the next day he rode on in numbness and unconcern. Waking slumber held him. It was a wilderland that he wandered unaware. He was in danger without knowing it. Lassitude was the first step in an inexorable logic, the law of leprosy. The next was gangrene, a stink of rotting live flesh so terrible that even some physicians could not bear it, a stench which ratified the outcasting of lepers in a way no mere compassion or unprejudice could oppose. But Covenant traveled his dream with his mind full of sleep. When he began to recover, early in the afternoon of the third day from soaring Woodhelven, the 18th since the company had left Revelstone, he found himself looking over Morin Moss Forest. The company stood on the last hilltop before the land fell under the dark aegis of the trees. Morin Moss lay at the foot of the hill like a lapping sea. Its edges gripped the hillsides as if the trees had clenched their roots in the slopes and refused to be driven back. The dark, various green of the forest spread to the horizon, north and east and south. It had a forbidding look. It seemed to defy the quest to pass through it. High Lord Prothal stopped on the crest of the hill and gazed for a long time over the forest, weighing the time needed to ride around Morin Moss against the obscure dangers of the trees. Finally, he dismounted. He looked over the riders, and his eyes were full of potential anger as he spoke. "We will rest now. Then we will ride into Morin Moss and will not stop until we have reached the far side, a journey of nearly a day and a night. During that ride we must show neither blade nor spark. Hear you? All swords sheathed, all bows quivered, all knives cloaked, all spear tips bound, and every spark or gleam of fire quenched. I will have no mistake. Morin Moss is wilder than Grimmerdor, and none go unanxious into that wild. The trees have suffered for ages, and they do not forget their kinship with garroting deep. Pray that they do not crush us all, regardless." He paused, scanning the company until he was sure that all understood him. Then he added more gently, "It is possible that there is still a Forrestal in Morin Moss, though that knowledge has been lost since the desecration." Several of the warriors tensed at the word Forrestal, but Covenant, coming slowly out of his languor, felt none of the awe which seemed to be expected of him. He asked, as he had done before, "Do you worship trees?" "Worship?" Prothal seemed puzzled. "The word is obscure to me." Covenant stared. A moment later the High Lord went on, "Do you ask if we reverence the forests? Of course. They are alive, and there is earth power in all living things, all stone and earth, and water and wood. Surely you understand that we are the servants of that power. We care for the life of the land. He glanced back at the forest, then continued. The earth power takes many forms between wood and stone. Stone bedrocks the world, and to the best of our comprehension, weak as it is, that form of power does not know itself. But wood is otherwise. At one time, in the dimmest lost distance of the past, nearly all the land was one forest, one mighty wood from Trothgard and Mellancurion Skyweir to Sarangrave Flat and Sea Reach. And the forest was awake. It knew and welcomed the new life which people brought to the land. It felt the pain when mere men, blind, foolish moments in the ancientness of the land, cut down and burned out the trees to make space in which to breathe their folly. It is hard to take pride in human history. Before the slow knowledge spread throughout the forest, so that each tree knew its peril, hundreds of leagues of life had been decimated. By our reckoning, the deed took time, more than 1,000 years, but it must have seemed a rapid murder to the trees. At the end of that time, there were only 4 places left in the land where the soul of the forest lingered, survived and shuddered in its awesome pain, and took resolve to defend itself. Then for many ages giant woods and Grimardor and Morin Moss and Garrotting Deep lived, and their awareness endured in the care of the forest stalls. They remembered, and no human or vile or cave wight who dared enter them survived. Now even those ages are past. We know not if the forest stalls yet live, though only a fool would deny that Carryall Wildwood still walks in Garrotting Deep. But the awareness which enabled the trees to strike back is fading. The lords have defended the forests since Beric Halfhand first took up the staff of law. We have not let the trees diminish. Yet their spirit fails. Cut off from each other, the collective knowledge of the forests dies, and the glory of the world becomes less than it was. Prothal paused sadly for a moment before concluding, "It is in deference to the remaining spirit and in reverence for the earth power that we ask permission for so many to enter the forest, one at one time. And it is in simple caution that we offer no offense. The spirit is not dead, and the power of Morin Moss could crush 1,000 men if the trees were pained into wakefulness." "Are there other dangers?" Quan asked. "Will we need our weapons?" "No. Lord Fowl's servants have done great harm to the forests in ages past. Perhaps Grimardor has lost its power, but Morin Moss remembers. And tonight is the dark of the moon. Even Drool Rockworm is not mad enough to order his forces into Morin Moss at such a time. And the despiser has never been such a fool." Quietly, the riders dismounted. Some of the yeomen fed the horses while others prepared a quick meal. Soon all the company except Covenant had eaten. And after the meal, while the Bloodguard watched, the questers laid themselves down to rest before the long passage of the forest. When they were roused again and ready to travel, Prothal strode up to the edge of the hill crest. The breeze was stronger there. It fluttered his black-slashed blue robe as he raised his staff and cried loudly, "Hail, Morin Moss, forest of the one forest, enemy of our enemies, Morin Moss, hail!" His voice fell into the expanse of the woods forlornly, without echo. "We are the lords, foes to your enemies, and learners of the Lilianril lore. We must pass through. Hearken, Morin Moss, we hate the axe and flame which hurt you. Your enemies are our enemies. Never have we brought edge of axe or flame or of fire to touch you, nor ever shall. Morin Moss, hearken, let us pass." His call disappeared into the depths of the forest. At last he lowered his arms and turned and came back to the company. He mounted his horse, looked once more sternly over the riders. At his signal, they rode down toward the knuckled edges of moor and moss. They seemed to fall like a stone into the forest. One moment they were still winding down the hillside above the trees. The next they had penetrated the gloomy deep, and the sunlight closed behind them like an unregainable door. Berenier went at the head of the company, with his firebrand staff held across his mount's neck, and behind him rode first Mark Tuvor on the Ranahin stallion Marnie. For the Ranahin had nothing to fear from the old anger of Moor and Moss, and Marnie could guide Berenier if the aged her-thrall went astray. Behind Tuvor came Prothol and Morum, with Laura at Morum's back, and behind them came Covenant and Foamfollower. The giant still carried the sleeping child. Then followed Quan and his yeomen, bunched together among the Bloodguard. There was room for them to pass. The trees with their dark mingled ebony and russet trunks were widely placed, leaving space between them for undergrowth and animals, and the riders found their way without difficulty. But the trees were not tall. They rose for 15 or 20 feet on squat trunks, then spread outward in gnarled, drooping branches heavy with foliage, so that the company was completely enshrouded in the gloom of moor and moss. The branches interwove until each tree seemed to be standing with its arms braced heavily on the shoulders of its kindred. And from the limbs hung great curtains and strands of moss, dark, thick, damp moss, falling from the branches like slow blood caught and frozen as it bled. The moss dangled before the riders as if it were trying to turn them aside, and deflect them from their path, and on the deep, mossy ground the hooves of the horses made no sound. The riders went their way as silently as if they had been translated into an illusion. Instinctively dodging away from the dark touch of the moss, Covenant peered into the forest's perpetual gloaming. As far as he could see in all directions, branch and trunk. He was surrounded by the grotesque ire of moss and branch and trunk. But beyond the limit of his explicit senses, he could see more, see and smell, and in the silence of the forest hear the brooding heart of the woods. There the trees contemplated their grim memories, the broad budding burst of self-awareness, when the spirit of the wood lay grandly over hundreds of leagues of rich earth, and the raw plummet of pain and horror and disbelief spreading like ripples on an ocean until the farthest leaves in the land shivered. When the slaughter of the trees began, root and branch and all cut and consumed by axe and flame, and stumps dragged away, and the scurry and anguish of the animals, slaughtered too, or bereft of home and health and hope, and the clear song of the forest stall, whose tune taught the secret angry pleasure of crushing, of striking back at tiny men and tasting their blood at the roots, and the slow weakness which ended even that last fierce joy and left the trees with nothing but their stiff memories and their despair as they watched their rage fall into slumber. Covenant sensed that the trees knew nothing of lords or friendship. The lords were too recent in the land to be remembered. No, it was weakness, the failure of spirit, that let the riders pass. Weakness, sorrow, helpless sleep. Here and there he could hear trees that were still awake and aching for blood. But they were too few, too few. Morin Moss could only brood, bereft of force by its own ancient mortality. A hand of moss struck him and left moisture on his face. He wiped the wet away as if it were acid. Then the sun set beyond Morin Moss, and even that low light was gone. Covenant leaned forward in his saddle, alert now, and afraid that Byrnair would lose his way or stumble into a curtain of moss and be smothered. But as darkness seeped into the air as if it were dripping from the enshrouding branches, a change came over the wood. Gradually a silver glow grew on the trunks, grew and strengthened as night filled the forest, until each tree stood shimmering like a lost soul in the gloom. The silver light was bright enough to show the riders their way. Across the shifting patterns of the glow, the moss sheets hung like shadows of an abyss, black holes into emptiness, giving the wood a blotched, leprous look. But the company huddled together and rode on through a night illumined only by the gleam of the trees and by the red burn of Covenant's ring. He felt that he could hear the trees muttering in horror at the offense of his wedding band, and its pulsing red glow appalled him. Moss fingers flickered his face with a wet, probing touch. He clenched his hands over his heart, trying to pull himself inward, reduce himself, and pass unnoticed. Rode as if he carried an axe under his robe, and was terrified lest the trees discover it. That long ride passed like the hurt of a wound. Acute throbs finally blurred together, and at last the company was again riding through the dimness of day. Covenant shivered, looking about within himself. What he saw left him mute. He felt that the cistern of his rage was full of darkness, but he was caught in toils of insoluble circumstance. The darkness was a cup which he could neither drink nor dash aside, and he was trembling with hunger. He could hardly restrain himself from striking back at the damp clutch of the moss. Still the company traveled the perpetual twilight of Morin Moss. They were silent, stifled by the enshrouding branches, and in the cloying quiet, Covenant felt as lost as if he had missed his way in the old forest which had covered all the land. With vague fury he ducked and dodged the grasping of the moss. Time passed, and he had a mounting desire to scream. Then finally Byrnair waved his staff over his head and gave a weak shout. The horses understood. They stumbled into a tired run beside the strong step of the Ranahin. For a moment the trees seemed to stand back, as if drawing away from the company's madness. Then the riders broke out into sunshine. They found themselves under a noon sky on a slope which bent gradually down to a river, lying squarely across their way. Byrnair and Marnie had brought them unerringly to Rome's Edge Ford. Hoarsely shouting their relief, the warriors set heels to their mounts, and the company swept down the slope at a brave gallop. Shortly the horses splashed into the stream, showering themselves and their glad riders with the cool spray of the Rome's Edge. On the southern bank, Prothal called a halt. The passage of Morin Moss was over. Once halted, the company tasted the toll of the passage. Their foodless vigil had weakened the riders, but the horses were in worse condition. They quivered with exhaustion. Once their last run was over, their necks and backs sagged. They scarcely had the strength to eat or drink. Despite the nickering encouragement of the Ranahin, 2 of the Omen mustangs collapsed on their sides on the grass, and the others stood around with unsteady knees like foals. "Rest, rest," Prothal said in broomy anxiety. We go no farther this day. He walked among the horses, touching them with his old hands and humming a strengthening song. Only the Ranahan and the Bloodguard were unmarred by fatigue. Foamfollower lowered the child Python into Laura's arms, then dropped himself wearily on his back on the stiff grass. Since the company had left soaring Woodhelven, he had been unnaturally silent. He had avoided speaking as if he feared his voice would betray him. Now he appeared to feel the strain of traveling without the support of stories and laughter. Covenant wondered if he would ever hear the giant laugh again. Sourly he reached a hand up to get his staff from Dura's saddle and noticed for the first time what Morin Moss had done to his white robe. It was spattered and latticed with dark green stains, the markings of the moss. The stains offended him. With a scowl he looked around the company. The other riders must have been more adept at dodging. They showed none of the green signature of the moss. Lord Moram was the only exception. Each shoulder of his robe bore a dark stripe like an insignia. Roughly, Covenant rubbed at the green, but it was dry and set. Darkness murmured in his ears like the distant rumor of an avalanche. His shoulders hunched like a strangler's. He turned away from the questers, stamped back into the river. Knotting his fingers in his robe, he tried to scrub out the stains of the forest, but the marks had become part of the fabric. Immitigable. They clung to his robe, signing it like a chart, a map to unknown regions. In a fit of frustration, he pounded the river with his fists, but its current erased his ripples as if they had never existed. He stood erect and dripping in the stream. His heart labored in his chest. For a moment, he felt that his rage must either overflow or crack him to the bottom. None of this is happening. His jaw quivered. I can't stand it. Then he heard a low cry of surprise from the company. An instant later, Moram commanded quietly, "Come, Covenant, come." Spitting protests against so many things that he could not name them all. He turned around. The questers were all facing away from him, their attention bent on something which he could not see because of the water in his eyes. Moram repeated, "Come." Covenant wiped his eyes, waded to the bank, and climbed out of the river. He made his dripping way through the yeomen until he reached Moram and Prothol. Before them stood a strange woman. She was slim and slight, no taller than Covenant's shoulder, and dressed in a deep brown shift which left her legs and arms free. Her skin was sun-darkened to the color of earth. Her long black hair she wore tied into one strand by a heavy cord. The effect was severe, but this was relieved by a small necklace of yellow flowers. Despite her size, she stood proudly with her arms folded and her legs slightly apart, as if she could deny the company entrance to the plains of Ra if she chose. She watched Covenant's approach as if she had been waiting for him. When he stopped, joining Moram and Prothol, she raised her hand and gave him the salute of welcome awkwardly, as if it were not a natural gesture for her. "Hail, Ringthane," she said in a clear, nickering voice. "White gold is known. We homage and serve. Be welcome." He shook the water from his forehead and stared at her. After greeting him, she turned with a ritual precision toward each of the others. "Hail, High Lord Prothol. Hail, High Lord Moram. Hail, Saltheart Foamfollower. Hail, First Mark Tuvor. Hail, Warhaft Quan. In turn, they saluted her gravely, as if they recognized her as a potentate. Then she said, I am main thrall Lithe. We see you. Speak. The plains of Ra are not open to all. Prothal stepped forward. Raising his staff, he held it in both hands, level with his forehead, and bowed deeply. At this, the woman smiled faintly. Holding her own palms beside her head, she matched his bow. This time her movement was smooth, natural. You know us, she said. You come from afar, but you are not unknowing. Prothal replied, We know that the main thralls are the first tenders of the Ranahin. Among the Ramen you are most honored, and you know us. He stood close to her now, and the slight stoop of his agedness inclined him over her. Her brown skin and his blue robe accentuated each other like earth and sky, but still she withered her welcome. No, she returned, not now. You come from afar, unknown, yet you speak our names. She shrugged. We are cautious. We have watched since you left Morinmoss. We heard your talk. We? Covenant wondered blankly. Slowly her eyes moved over the company. We know the sleepless ones, the blood guard. She did not appear pleased to see them. They take the Ranahin into peril, but we serve. They are welcome. Then her gaze settled on the two collapsed horses, and her nostrils flared. You have urgency? She demanded, but her tone said that she would accept few justifications for the condition of the mustangs. At that, Covenant understood why she hesitated to welcome the lords, though they must have been known to her, at least by legend or reputation. She wanted no one who mistreated horses to enter the plains of Ra. The High Lord answered with authority, Yes, Fang Thane lives. Lithe faltered momentarily. With her eyes turned to Covenant, they swarmed with hints of distant fear. Fang Thane, she breathed, enemy of Earth and Ranahin. Yes, White Gold knows. The Ring Thane is here. Abruptly, her tone became hard. To save the Ranahin from rending. She looked at Covenant as if demanding promises from him. He had none to give her. He stood angrily dripping, too soaked with hunger to respond in repudiation or acquiescence or shame. Soon she retreated in bafflement. To Prothal she said, Who is he? What manner of man? With an ambivalent smile, Prothal said, He is Lord Thomas Covenant, Unbeliever and White Gold wielder. He is a stranger to the land. Do not doubt him. He turned the battle for us when we were beset by the servants of Fangthane. Cave wights and Erviles, and a griffin spawned in some unknown pit of malice. Lithe nodded noncommittally as if she did not understand all his words. But then she said, There is urgency. No action against Fangthane must be hindered or delayed. There have been other signs. Rending beasts have sought to cross into the plains. High Lord Prothal, be welcome in the plains of Ra. Come with all speed to Manholm. We must take counsel. Your welcome honors us, the High Lord responded. We return honor in accepting. We will reach Manholm the second day from today, if the horses live. His cautious speech made Lithe laugh lightly. You will rest in the hospitality of the Ramen before the sun sets a second time from this moment. We have not served the Ranahin knowledgeless from the beginning. Cords, up! Here is a test for your maning. At once 4 figures appeared. They suddenly stood up from the grass in a loose semicircle around the company, as if they had risen out of the ground. The four, 3 men and a woman, were as slight as Mainthral live, but and dressed like her in brown over their tanned skin. But they wore no flowers, and had short lengths of rope wrapped around their waists. "Come, Cords," said Lithe. "Stalk these riders no longer. You have heard me welcome them. Now tend their horses and their safety. They must reach Manholm before nightfall of the next day." The 4 Ramen stepped forward, and Lithe said to Prothal, "Here are my cords, Thew, Hearn, Grace, and Rusta. They are hunters. While they learn the ways of the Ranahin and the knowing of the main thralls, they protect the lands from dangerous beasts. I have spent much time with them. They can care for your mounts." With courteous nods to the company, the Cords went straight to the horses and began examining them. "Now," Lithe continued, "I must depart. The word of your coming must cross the plains. The Windhomes must prepare for you. Follow Rusta. He is nearest to his maning. Hail, lords. We will eat together at nightfall of the new day." Without waiting for a reply, the main thrall turned southward and sprinted away. She ran with surprising speed. In a few moments she had crested a hill and vanished from sight. Watching her go, Moram said to Covenant, "It is said that a main thrall can run with the Ranahin for a short time." Behind them, Cord Hearn muttered, "It is said, and it is true." Moram faced the Cord. He stood as if waiting to speak. His appearance was much like Lithe's, although his hair had not been permitted to grow as long as hers, and his features had a dour cast. When he had Moram's attention, he said, "There is a grass which will heal your horses. I must leave you to bring it." Gently the Lord responded, "The knowing is yours. Do what is best." Hearn's eyes widened, as if he had not expected soft words from people who mistreated horses. Then, uncertain of his movements, he saluted Moram in Lord's fashion. Moram returned a ramen bow. Hearn grinned and was about to gallop away when Covenant abruptly asked, "Why don't you ride? You've got all those Ranahin." Moram moved swiftly to restrain Covenant, but the damage was already done. Huron stared as if he had heard blasphemy, and his strong fingers twitched the rope from about his waist, holding it between his fists like a garrote. "We do not ride." "Have a care, Hearn," said Cord Rusta softly. The main thrall welcomed him. Hearn glared at his companion, then roughly reknotted his rope around his waist. He spun away from the company and soon vanished as if he had disappeared into the earth. Gripping Covenant's arm, Moram said sternly, "The Ramen serve the Ranahin. That is their reason for life. Do not affront them, unbeliever. They are quick to anger, and the deadliest hunters in the land. There might be 100 of them within the range of my voice, and you would never know. If they chose to slay you, you would die ignorant." Covenant felt the force of the warning. It seemed to invest the surrounding grass with eyes that peered balefully. He felt conspicuous, as if his green-mapped robe were a guide for deadly intentions hidden in the ground. He was trembling again. While Hearn was away, the rest of the Cords worked on the horses, caressing, cajoling them into taking water and food. Under their hands, most of the mustangs grew steadier. Satisfied that their mounts were in good hands, the lords went to talk with Quan and Tuvor, and around them the warriors began preparing food. Covenant cursed the aroma. He lay on the stiff grass and tried to still his gnawing emptiness by staring at the sky. Fatigue caught up with him, and he dozed for a while, But soon he was roused by a new smell which made his hunger sting in his guts. It came from clumps of rich ferny flowers that the horses were munching, the healing herbs which Cord Hearn had brought for them. All the horses were on their feet now, and they seemed to gain strength visibly as they ate. The piquant odor of the flowers gave Covenant a momentary vision of himself on his hands and knees, chewing like the horses, and he muttered in suppressed savagery, "Damn horses eat better than we do." Cord Rusta smiled oddly and said, "This grass is poison to humans. It is Amanipavan, the flower of health and madness. Horses it heals, but men and women, they are not enough for it." Covenant answered with a glare and tried to stifle the groan of his hunger. He felt a perverse desire to taste the grass. It sang to his senses delectably. Yet the thought that he had been brought so low was bitter to him, and he savored its sourness instead of food. Certainly the plants worked wonders for the horses. Soon they were feeding and drinking normally, and looked sturdy enough to bear riders again. The questers finished their meal, then packed away their supplies. The Cords pronounced the horses ready to travel. Shortly the riders were on their way south over the swift hills of Ra, with the Ra men trotting easily beside them. Under the hooves of the horses, the grasslands rolled and passed like mild billows, giving the company an impression of speed. They rode over the hardy grass, up and down short, low slopes, along shallow valleys between copses and small woods beside the thin streams, across broad flats. It was a rough land. Except for the faithful Eliantha, the terrain was unrefined by fruit trees or cultivation or any flowers other than Amanibhavam. But still the plains seemed full of elemental life, as if the low, quick hills were formed by the pulse of the soil, and the stiff grass were rich enough to feed anything strong enough to bear its nourishment. When the sun began to set, the bracken on the hillsides glowed purple. Herds of nilgai came out of the woods to drink at the streams, and ravens flocked clamorously to the broad chintz trees which dotted the flats. But the riders gave most of their attention to the roaming Ranahin, whether galloping by like triumphal banners or capering together in evening play. The great horses wore an aura of majesty, as if the very ground they thundered on were proud of their creation. They called in fierce joy to the bearers of the blood guard, and these chargers did little dances with their hoofs, as if they could not restrain the exhilaration of their return home. Then the unmounted Ranahin dashed away, full of gay blood and unfetterable energy, whinnying as they ran. Their calls made the air tingle with vitality. Soon the sun set in the west, bidding farewell to the plains with a flare of orange. Covenant watched it go with dour satisfaction. He was tired of horses, tired of Ranahin and Raman and Bloodguard and lords and quests, tired of the unrest of life. He wanted darkness and sleep, despite the blood burn of his ring, the new coming crescent of the moon, and the vulture wings of horror. But when the sun was gone, Rusta told Prothal that the company would have to keep on riding. There was danger, he said. Warnings had been left in the grass by other Ramen. The company would have to ride until they were safe, a few leagues more. So they traveled onward. Later the moon rose, and its defiled sliver turned the night to blood, calling up a lurid answer from Covenant's ring and his hungry soul. Then Rusta slowed the riders, warned them to silence. With as much stealth as they could muster, they angled up the south side of a hill and stopped just below its crest. The company dismounted, left a few of the bloodguard to watch over the horses, and followed the cords to the hilltop. Low, flat ground lay to the north. The cords peered across it for some time, then pointed. Covenant fought the fatigue of his eyes and the crimson dimness until he thought he saw a dark patch moving southward over the flat. "Cresh," whispered Hearn. "Yellow wolves, Fangthane's brood. They have crossed Rome's edge." "Wait for us," Rusta breathed. "You will be safe." He and the other cords faded into the night. Instinctively the company drew closer together and stared with throbbing eyes through the thin red light, which seemed to ooze like sweat from the moving darkness on the flat. In suspense they stood hushed, hardly breathing. Python sat in Laura's arms, as wide awake as a vigil. Covenant learned later that the pack numbered 15 of the great yellow wolves. Their foreshoulders were waist-high on a man. They had massive jaws lined with curved, ripping fangs, and yellow omnivorous eyes. They were drooling on the trail of 2 Ranahin foals, protected only by a stallion and his mare. The legends of the Ramen said that the breath of such creche was hot enough to scorch the ground, and they left a wheal of pain across the grass wherever their plundering took them. But all Covenant saw now was an approaching darkness, growing larger moment by moment. Then, to his uncertain eyes, the rear of the pack appeared to swirl in confusion briefly, and as the wolves moved on, he thought he could see 2 or 3 black spots lying motionless on the flat. The pack swirled again. This time several short howls of surprise and fear broke the silence. One harsh snarl was suddenly choked off. The next instant the pack started a straight dash toward the company, leaving 5 more dots behind. But now Covenant was sure that the dots were dead wolves. 3 more creche dropped. Now he could see 3 figures leap away from the dead and sprint after the survivors. They vanished into shadows at the foot of the hill. From the darkness came sounds of fighting, enraged snarls, the snap of jaws that missed their mark, bones cracking. The silence flooded back into the night. The apprehension of the company sharpened, for they could see nothing. The shadow reached almost to the crest of the hill where they stood. Abruptly, they heard the sound of frantic running. It came directly toward them. Prothal sprang forward. He raised his staff, and blue fire flared from its tip. The sudden light revealed a lone creche with hatred in its eyes, pelting at him. Tuvor reached Prothal's side an instant before Foamfollower, but the giant went ahead to meet the wolf's charge. Then, without warning, Cord Grace rose out of hiding, squarely in front of the wolf. She executed her movement as smoothly as if she were dancing. As she stood, a swift jerk freed her rope. When the creche sprang at her, she flipped a loop of the rope around its neck and stepped neatly aside, turning as she did so to brace her feet. The force of the wolf's charge as it hit her noose, broke its neck. The yank pulled her from her feet, but she rolled lightly to one side, keeping pressure on the rope, and came to her feet in a position to find the creche if it were still alive. The yeoman met her performance with a low murmur of admiration. She glanced toward them and smiled diffidently in the blue light of Prothal's staff. Then she turned to greet the other cords as they loped out of the shadow of the hill. They were uninjured. All the wolves were dead. Lowering his staff, Prothal gave the cords a ramen bow. "Well done," he said. They bowed in acknowledgement. When he extinguished his staff, red darkness returned to the hilltop. In the bloodlight, The riders began moving back to their horses, but Banor stepped over to the dead wolf and pulled Grace's rope from around its neck. Holding the cord in a fighting grip, he stretched it taut. "A good weapon," he said with his awkward inflectionlessness. "The Ramen did mighty work with it in the days when High Lord Kevin fought corruption openly." Something in his tone reminded Covenant that the Bloodguard were lusty men who had gone unwived for more than 2,000 years. Then, on the spur of an obscure impulse, Banor tightened his muscles and the rope snapped. Shrugging slightly, he dropped the pieces on the dead Kresh. His movement had the finality of a prophecy. Without a glance at Cord Grace, he left the hilltop to mount the Ranahan that had chosen him.